So hello everybody and welcome back, and I hope everyone has had the opportunity to maybe check out the networking parts of the platform, maybe look at the exhibition area, and also I guess have a chance to have a bit of a break and maybe grab a tea or coffee as well. So it's great to have everyone back, and we're really looking forward to the second session now, because a lot of the discussion around or a lot of discussion we've heard so far has been focusing on the investment and funding opportunities, and so we're delighted to now have a session that's going to be focusing specifically on that. Once again, I'm going to bring our speakers, our moderator and speakers up now. But once again, before we start, just to remind everyone, please do please do add your comments and questions into the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen. We are going to be having a good 30 minutes or so, hopefully, for discussion at the end of the panel, and we want to hear from you, and we'll be putting as many of those questions as we can to the speakers. So that said, I am delighted now to welcome to the stage our moderator for this first session, Mikhail Opitz from Arthur D. Little. So Mikhail, welcome. It's great to have you with us. And as I said, we're really looking forward to the panel. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, for the kind introduction, and a warm welcome from my side to all the participants around the globe. Pleasure for me to moderate this panel. My name is Michael Opitz. I'm a partner with Arthur D. Little, and I'm leading our telecoms, IT, and media sector practice here in Central Europe. Let me frame the topic a little bit. We are talking about the new EU Recovery and Resilience Facility will provide an unprecedented level of public financing to kickstart the relaunch of the economy and boost private investments in key sectors and technologies. In this context, investment in 5G have been made a priority and will constitute a large part of the 130 billion targeted to digital. It will accelerate the infrastructure deployment in challenge areas like rural areas or alongside railways, and pave the way to advanced 5G and even 6G. At the same time, the EU aims at boosting the new use cases and new ecosystems that are key for digital transformation, using also venture capital funding. This session will look at how this can be best achieved using the full range of EU programs, and which are the areas that can benefit most from the funding that is available. It will look at the role that the RRF can play in stimulating broader public and private investment in 5G moving forward, and at the potential that this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity offers to unleash the power of 5G. Let me now introduce the first speaker to you, and I'm very happy that we have Jiva Dustar with us, Head of Division Innovation Finance Advisory at the European Investment Bank. And I think, Shiva, it's an exciting day for you and the EIB, as you have just today launched your latest report on how to accelerate the 5G transition in Europe, and you will share the latest news with us, and we're very much looking forward to that. So over to you, Shiva.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So thanks also to the organizers for having invited the EIB to this particular panel, and also the European Commission, our partner in this. It is indeed an exciting day because we are taking this opportunity to launch our report, and you will get more details about it and where you can download it shortly. You will get insights into why this report was actually so pivotal, and why this is a perfect opportunity to also really bring it in out at this particular conference. Maybe by way of brief introduction to those of you who may not know the European Investment Bank as well as you should, perhaps. So this is your chance. You will see on this slide a rather crowded, a lot of elements and a rather crowded slide. Why is that? Well, it is because the EIB and its subsidiary, the EIF, have actually a whole range of financial products that can pretty much cater to companies from their birth all the way, as they grow. And you will see, therefore, on this slide that we have financial instruments that are managed by our subsidiary, the European Investment Fund. They are mainly through intermediaries, either through funds, venture capital funds, or to the banking sector. And then as companies grow and become more mature, they obviously have then access to also direct financing from the European Investment Bank through venture debt and other instruments. So together, this is already quite an important access of financing. And we've also added below an initiative that you hopefully have all heard of, the European Innovation Council flagship blended finance facility by the European Commission, which has both grants and also equity investments available. So, the reason we mention this is because you could think that we actually have all the right products and that we should therefore be able to cater to all the innovative companies that are also now being enabled by the 5G, technologies. Unfortunately, the reality is nevertheless different, and we will tell you a bit more about it later. So perhaps the next slide. Now, also a brief introduction that in addition to financing, the EIB also provides advisory support. This is both technical and financial advisory. The team that I'm leading is involved on the financial advisory side, and we do so by these three major activities. Thematic studies like the 5G report that we're launching today, project advisory where we are actively working with project promoters to orient them towards the right financing from the European Investment Banking Group, but also potentially other investors, and prepare them basically for due diligence and improve their access to finance. And then some ecosystem development that very often leads to potential new products that we put or adapt products, and in a way use both the Commission and our own convening power to bring the key players together. We believe, and you will see also in this study, that these are actually very important additional measures that very often are critical to make the financing actually more accessible to those who need it most. Next slide, please. On our website, you will actually have access to a number of our existing studies. So there are over 30 of them across the whole spectrum, whether it's on the digital economy side or on sustainability and climate change, and always with the lens of access to finance, so that this is really for us also a way to understand how well our own financial products are situated when emerging sectors are coming on board, and therefore new potential clients of the EIB would like to access our products. Next slide, please. Now, this is basically the cover of the report, and maybe a few words on why we actually were asked to do this particular study. The request came from the European Commission, almost 2 years ago, very much with the foresight of the European Commission that as the 5G infrastructure is going to be put in place, there will be a huge potential for companies that are then enabled by this infrastructure to provide new business solutions. And the question, therefore, to us was to look downstream at these companies and see whether they also have the same access and benefit of all these financing mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. So therefore, in anticipation, we were asked to do a rather broad outreach, do some significant market consultation together with a consultancy firm, Axon, and bring some key findings and also recommendations to the table. Now, of course, the study happened then at some stage in the middle of we saw ourselves in the middle of the COVID crisis, and it was fascinating to see in a way how we all were forced, and society as a whole, to accelerate in a way the digital uptake. And therefore, I think the relevance of this study and the interest in it actually became quite high. And hence, it is actually quite exciting for us to bring this study at a time when we believe that we have quite a lot of opportunities for these companies to actually perhaps be even seen as more relevant than they were, before the crisis. Next slide, please. Now, as we looked into sort of the scope of the study, what became quite clear is the importance of the wider ecosystem, and to look at both the supply and the demand for 5G technologies. So, and to see sort of the dynamic that happens, and that you have ultimately also companies, innovative business solutions coming on both sides. And that also, as part of the demand dynamic, that it is going to be quite quite a vast transformational power that actually is going to be unleashed across many sectors, and hence, that we will need to really look at all the various financing tools that we have in place, starting from grants to equity to debt products, to ensure that this rather wide range of companies that may actually ultimately also be of different sizes, of different risk profiles, have all adequate access to financing. So this was actually an important sort of assessment. Next slide, please. Now, you obviously, the audience, and you all know the situation much better than we do, but clearly, 5G has a huge potential, and we're just at the early days of it. So it will clearly encompass many industries, and you will hear later in the panel somehow some of the key players are actually going to tap into this potential. So for many, it is quite obvious, but we will see now shortly that when it came to financing, it wasn't always all that obvious to actually get that narrative and the story across. Next slide, please. Now, so what actually came out in the interviews was that many of the SMEs really did have a hard time to get to translate the business potential in an investment narrative that actually would bring venture capitalists and those very often even specialized investors really on board early on. So you will see in our report, and please feel free to read through some of those examples in more detail. There were, one classical situation was that companies, indeed, when they reached out to venture capitalists, they had a hard time to make a convincing case. They ultimately ended up getting some grant funding, but that was often seen as not only insufficient in amount, but also nevertheless quite bureaucratic, and coming with a lot of hurdles and strings attached. So this was unfortunately a more recurring story, and hence what we felt was that there was indeed perhaps an information asymmetry between the existing investor, financial investor community and these companies. And also on the company side, we often realized that they weren't always fully aware of the broad range of instruments at their disposal. Next slide, please. Now, as a result, and now a very brief summary of the recommendations, but please do reach out to the report on our website for more detail. There are three categories of recommendations that we made: some financing measures, non-financing measures, and policy measures. I will focus actually on the upper two ones. And perhaps let's go straight into that next slide. So on the financing measures, as I mentioned earlier, what we discovered is we actually have quite a range of existing tools, and perhaps it's a matter of adapting them and maybe creating some dedicated envelopes like we have done for artificial intelligence and blockchain, so that those particular existing instruments, very often managed by our subsidiary European Investment Fund, are becoming also accessible to those innovative SMEs in this space. So that is one set of recommendations. The next set is to take it a step further, because ultimately what we also found out, and this came out from some of the corporate VCs in our market consultation, that the corporate VCs could actually play a very important role to fill a bit the information gap. They understand the strategic value, and if you can find a governance that ultimately aligns the strategic and the financial interests of those investors, they could both come as LPs into funds that then have a more dedicated focus to 5G. So that is a second set of recommendations which we hope will be considered. A third set of recommendations are actually to be maybe even more ambitious and set up some 5G co-investment platform. This would in itself create some scale and perhaps also speed in sort of aggregating some of these investments and make them more accessible and visible to the wider community. Moving to perhaps then the next slide and to the non-financial measures. Here, what came out as one of the key recommendations was actually this notion of sandboxing, and perhaps we'll hear of it more later in the panel. So these testing facilities that actually make the potential of SME working in this space more real, and also provide them with an enabling ecosystem to test ultimately their business models. So this is something that we hope is actually going to perhaps be further broadened and with the support of the national and the EU bodies be put in place. There are other recommendations such as more targeted advisory support, also ways to disseminate the information like conferences like this, but also perhaps more targeted events, and using also obviously the digital platforms in order to do so. The next slide, please. So I'm coming now to the conclusion. Here on this, you have the QR code of both an executive summary and a full report. Please feel free to use obviously the QR code. There's also, you can find this report on our EIB website. Please do reach out to the authors, Mr. Yaro Toth and François Gilles, or myself. We would be delighted to carry on conversations with you, especially if you're looking for financing or if you're somehow an actor in this market on the financing side and would like to see how you can become more involved. So without further ado, maybe the next slide, just to have our contact details also for you, I will conclude and again thank the organizers and the European Commission in particular, also with a big thanks to Philippe Lefebvre, who is on the panel, for having given us this opportunity to do the study jointly. And we really do hope that this is just the beginning, because there's definitely lots to do to implement the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shiva, for this inspiring presentation. I think you will experience many downloads, so your servers may run hot today. And as you said, we will pick up many of the questions later in the panel discussion. So thanks again for your presentation. So let me now introduce all the panelists to you. And then if I may ask you to bring them all up here on the screen, that everybody can see them. And we start with Philippe Lefebvre here on the top, who is the head of the 5G sector and 5G deployment strategy at the European Commission's DG Connect. Bonjour, Philippe.
Bonjour.
We have then Harald Gruber, head of the digital infrastructure division at the projects directorate of the European Investment Bank. Hello, Harald.
Hello, everybody.
Here. Then we move on with Adrian Brazon, who is Director of Network and Security Projects at the Directorate General for Enterprises, which is under the authority of the Minister of the Economy and Finance in France.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. Then we have Susan Yu. She's Senior Investment Director at Robert Bosch Venture Capital. Hello, Susan. And then we have Luigi Ardito, who is a Senior Director of Government Affairs at Qualcomm.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Michael.
Hello. So good to have you all here. And everybody will give a short introductory presentation before we start the open panel discussion.
I cannot hear you. If the problem persists, please go to the next speaker.
Can you hear me?
I can still, no, I can, I'm back with you.
Okay, wonderful. Then we start with you, Philippe. And you will talk about how 5G will grow the telecom market. And over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And good afternoon, morning, evening, depending on your time zone. Because this is a short introduction, I'm likely to highlight from a Commission's perspective issues that are also likely to be addressed from a specific angle by my fellow panelists. So there may be some redundancy here. But to start, let me remind that of the investors' mood at the time where 3G and 4G were launched. Already then, most operators were arguing that there was no real demand for the new communications technology. And there were significant investment to deploy 3G and 4G anyway. The difference today in 5G is that we start from a better situation. We already see the kind of applications that can be addressed by this new technology. What the financiers call the trending is clear. However, investments are not yet anywhere near what they should be to address this potential demand. So for us, when we look at the macro perspective, the situation is obvious. We try to illustrate that on this slide. We have a chicken and egg problem. We have a big chicken. It's the infrastructure investments that are needed. Estimates are 300 to 500 billion. So we know the size of the chicken. What we know less is the size of the demand side. We have to create it from scratch. Of course, there is already the existing demand from the consumer market, and that will continue and expand. But the totally new demand, which is the main justification for the interest of the public actors like us in 5G, because of the externalities that this creates in terms of environment, potential benefit for environment, the digital transformation, and all these societal benefits. This we have to create. We have basically two tools to help bridging this gap between supply and demand. First, we have our financial firing power. And there we know with the new RRF now, Recovery Fund, we have a brand new powerful weapon. We have, as Pierre said, up to 40 billion potentially, depending on how member states will also mobilize these amounts to fuel the infrastructure investments. What we also need to do, and that's all the value of the study we have just finalized under the EIB leadership, is how to fuel the demand side, how this new innovation will take off. We expect that the innovation 5G will be much more entrepreneurial, startup-like than in the past, and that's an opportunity that we cannot miss, of course. And our mission is to break up this conundrum between this chicken and egg situation conundrum, and we have to use the two levers we have. The second lever is what is sometimes called our soft power as a broker, as an honest broker between the stakeholders' interest. And there we have already pioneered an approach in the transport area where we work with stakeholders on strategic deployment agendas. And that's a way to accelerate and build the ecosystems around 5G applications. This is, in my view, as important role as our role on the financial side, because that's really where we can ensure that our leadership in research can translate into leadership in market application and creating value for the European society. So that's very important that we know, how would I say, that we know shift to some extent or in phases from research to ecosystem building. Both go together, but we lack of, as compared to other regions, we lack at the moment of competitive advantage in this area. Next slide, please. One of the elements to do that is that we need to deploy what we call the true 5G. It's much harder to deploy the right networks for the emerging use cases in the vertical industry than it is to upgrade the existing network for 5G for consumers, for 5G broadband. It will require to invest in advanced technologies like edge clouds, or network slicing together with the physical infrastructure. And it will also require to deploy a network according to new pattern, geographical patterns, for example, for along roads, for industrial zones, or for special IoT applications. So concretely, we need to put incentives in place and the right framework so that the true 5G networks can be deployed timely. Last slide, please. Let me wrap up on financial sustainability. Sustainability. While public investment can boost infrastructure deployment and to some extent de-risk investors, we don't want to end up with infrastructures that are not used. That would be, of course, detrimental for welfare. We need to make sure that the demand, as I said, comes with it. And following the concept I just outlined, we need to develop roadmaps and strategic deployment agendas in as many sectors as we can. We've already started in road and trains, but we need to go fast and to expand to new areas. I would be glad if we would take more into account the fact that our 5G strategy should be driven by the recognition that we have a financial capacity shortage in Europe, and I would say also we don't have really the right financial attitude and risk-taking attitude towards these new sectors. I'll wrap up by reminding you of the President von der Leyen's statement at the Master of Digital 2020 event. She said, "I'm convinced that Europe is punching well above its weight in digital. I believe this is because of two reasons," she said. The obvious one is the lack of investment, and the second one, rules and regulations. So all I wish is that Europe starts punching at the right level thanks to a more ambitious approach to 5G investment. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Philippe. Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. And it's good to hear that you give hope to the telecom sector that the market will grow thanks to the true 5G, so to say. I think this is good news for the sector. Thank you. So let's move on to Harald Gruber from EIB, who will share with us the view of a public policy bank on 5G. Over to you, Harald.
I think you're on mute, Harold.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my views to this audience. What I would like to do is to complement what has said Shiva by looking more in detail into the financier's perspective for infrastructure. Because after all, you need infrastructure. Next slide, please. You need infrastructure to get all those services that we have just mentioned, that have been mentioned, and also to reap them in the future. The problem is that 5G is basically a technology-driven deployment. So basically, it's not so much demand-driven, it's more technology-driven. So investors and also operators, they're not too keen in investing early into this infrastructure. And as a result of that, they need some sort of kick by the public sector. So the public sector policymakers typically then basically make schemes for future development of technologies, of future rollout of technology. And that's exactly what's also happening here with 5G. We have the strategy outlined already by the Commission in 2016, which is then have been complemented also by the Gigabit Society. So you have very detailed rollout scenarios for this technology. But if you talk to the infrastructure providers and telecom companies, they are a little bit hesitant in basic investing in that. And therefore, on one hand, they are sort of hand twisted to do it, but on the other hand, they look at their balance sheets at the end, because at the end they must make money out of it. And this is a little bit a difficult undertaking, because quite a lot of the money comes from the services and not so much from the infrastructure. And therefore, this is a big challenge if you want to create this infrastructure on a sort of a universal basis, because to have this infrastructure really well working, you need a very fairly uniformly deployed infrastructure. So when we are talking about 5G deployment, you're never sure what people actually mean by it. Is it just sort of initial rollout of 5G? Are there some pilot services involved? Or is that really a fully fledged rollout? Next slide, please. And as a result of that, you can see it is far from being a roaring success. I mean, the technology is available since some time already, but the deployment at a large scale is not that quick. And therefore, for instance, in Europe, we have the target of the Gigabit Society to cover all cities, all urban areas by 2025, along with the transport corridors. And there is still some way to go to achieve those targets. Next slide, please. I mean, this is next slide again, please. So what we have done at the bank is, when we are a policy bank, so we have to figure out what are the costs of policies or policy aims. And that's what we did, for instance, with the Gigabit Society. We figured out of how much it would cost under certain assumptions. I mean, you have to make a whole load of assumptions, but there's some sort of assumptions that seem to be reasonable on the technologies and on the rollout perspective of how much it would cost to have the Gigabit Society rolled out. The Gigabit Society is one part of it is fiber infrastructure, basically fiber to the home, and one part of it is 5G. Now, the 5G connectivity is a bill of around 65 billion. Which is not small, but it's something you simply say, okay, it should be reasonable, some sort of. And here is the big end. You have to be aware that this is only cities and possibly some transport corridors. So to have 5G really running on a full scale, you need to cover also non-urban areas. And that's one of the next things that we are doing. We have now, we are undertaking a study of how much it would cost to cover areas which are not necessarily very appealing from a financial and from an investor's point of view. So areas which have long payback periods and uncertain payback periods at all. So there's quite a lot of financial risk for private investors in there. Now, we have sort of first round of estimates provide us with figures which are more in the 400 billion line. If you would really cover the whole of Europe, the Union, with 5G coverage. So this is already something fairly substantial. It is something that is needed if you really want to roll out the full possibilities of services. I mean, that because you have seen before, there are slides which basically project new possibilities for services, and a number of them are very intuitive. You think, and also now with our COVID crisis, we realize that these can be very, very valuable services, but they need to be rolled out, and for that you need to mobilize investment. And clearly, to do that, you need, to a large degree, this should be done by private investment. So it should be done. Public investment should help to leverage private investment. So that's basically what is our point of view. Now, next slide, please. Now, what does the EIB do in this context? We take 5G in a sort of a holistic approach. We start from infrastructure providers. So basically, it is a European technology. Mobile technology is genuinely a European technology. As a matter of fact, two of the largest players in the world are European companies. And so basically what the EIB does, it's trying to support the R&D, the long-term R&D perspective of such operators, of such companies. And therefore we are looking at investments in the research and development of 5G. And very soon we will do similar things also for 6G. And then the next step would be then having sort of supporting the rollout of pilots for 5G infrastructure. And then, of course, support to the extent that the market forces alone are not doing it or not doing it in time. Because remember, the target is 2025. So the market, almost for sure, will not deliver those targets if you leave that just on the company's poor market emotions for rolling out such infrastructure. So it needs an additional push from the public sector, which could be of various kinds. And that does not just need to be grants; it can also be financial instruments, basically risk-sharing type of operations. Now, next slide, please. This gives you a sort of a small view of what the bank is doing in terms of supporting companies in the field. This is just a small glimpse of it. There are much more have been supported by this, but just to give you an idea and about how much we are investing in this field. Next slide, please. One of the important things also that needs to be taken into account also for basically for the rollout of this type of infrastructure are security concerns. I mean, you have seen it to a large degree. I mean, who is following the press, that basically this is a big item. That basically there are certain suppliers which, out of security concerns, are not considered to be reliable suppliers, and so people or governments or policymakers would not like to have them involved in the rollout of critical infrastructure like 5G, which is bound to basically to support a large amount of services that should be provided over the next years. Next slide, please. Here is basically a sort of a matrix of the financial instrument. It's similar with what you have seen already before in Shiva's presentation about the instruments that are available from the bank. So basically, we are catering to bring up all those support mechanisms for infrastructure. Here it is by size and by the risk level. The very tricky part is basically on the where you see the red boxes, and we are developing projects precisely along those lines. Part of it is already also in the report presented by Shiva. And yeah, next slide, please. Let me.
Harold, sorry for stepping in. I think we need slowly. Now come the conclusions.
Come with the conclusions. Yes, indeed. So basically, 5G is. On one hand, it's the natural outcome of technological conclusion, but the market not very often are following up on that. So they basically, therefore, public support is needed, and it is coming up. We also with the different facilities coming up with the recovery plans. And what is the big challenge is basically roll out 5G infrastructure in non-urban areas. And basically, the bank is very carefully looking at projects in that field. And we hope that very soon there will be an interesting a project coming up, which we are able to support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harold, for the presentation and the issues you addressed. I think we come back to them in the panel discussion, especially when it comes to the appetite to invest into 5G rollout in those challenge areas, the so-called challenge areas. So thank you for that, Harold. Let's now switch to the perspective of a private investor, Robert Bosch Venture Capital, represented by Suzanne. And we heard a couple of times that we need private money here. And Suzanne, I hope you have deep pockets. So over to you.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks for the opportunity to join this panel. I think my presentation is going to be quite short because Harold covered, quite a lot what I was about to address. But let's start with, Robert Bosch GmbH is a German privately owned corporation, and its core operating areas are spread across 4 business sectors, which are mobility solution, where around 60% of our revenue comes from, industrial technology, energy and building, and consumer goods like dishwashers and power tools, which Bosch is, I think, best known for in the public, and some of you may have used those a lot during the pandemic. These sectors are served by my close to 400,000 colleagues and 245 manufacturing sites worldwide, just to highlight the importance of manufacturing for our business and the link to 5G. Next slide, please. So Bosch plays an active part in shaping 5G, which includes activities like 5G Smart Association, which is investigating the potential effects 5G will have on complex semiconductor production. These findings are being incorporated in Bosch's new fab in Dresden, which will be ready for 5G from day one. Also, end of last year, Bosch had put its first 5G campus network into operation in one of its plant in Stuttgart. And as a leading IoT company that offers solutions for connected mobility, smart home, and connected industry, Bosch also facilitates every year the Bosch Connected World, an annual event to bring all related and interested parties together to inspire, educate, and also to connect people. We also believe in particular the combination of 5G, IoT, and AI, artificial intelligence, is one of the significant keys to accelerate technological development. And we at Robert Bosch Venture Capital trying to enrich our corporate activities with innovative and fast-moving startups. So how was VC business doing during these unusual times? Next slide, please. Quite well, I would say. If you look at the absolute numbers and of financings and investment amount, those might differ depending on the source, but the trend tend to be very similar. That the global VC investment continued to be strong during the pandemic. While the number of VC deals dropped slightly, the level of investment remained high as VC investors continued to invest into their existing portfolio. You see, though, that China shows a different trend here, but to see the whole picture, in particular in investing in 5G infrastructure, we need to consider what investments are done on top by corporates and by a couple of those famous Chinese 3-5+ years multi-billion-dollar plans. And the headlines in the news indicate a different picture for 5G investments, like China is outspending the US on 5G infrastructure, or China supercharges its 5G investments. So according to Deloitte, China outspent the US by $24 billion in 5G infrastructure from 2015 to 18. And by the way, US hasn't considered the EU as competitor in mobile technology for at least a decade. Instead, the US benchmarked itself to China, and the 5G competition is fierce, as we also have heard, or we're going to hear, between those two nations. So uncertainty about trade wars and China's economy slowed down last year are reflected in the trend you see in the diagram. So what else does VC like to invest? Next slide, please. First, the infrastructure. Right, Harold addressed it correctly. So the telecommunication industry, historically has centered around three main suppliers, as we all know: Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei, with little investment in telco infrastructure over the 5-10 years. And VC firms and startups typically indeed avoid wireless network infrastructure investment. It's just too much capex, too long sales cycles, and that's what we as VC just don't like. So nevertheless, for instance, we have looked into a couple photonics companies who is providing like transceivers for 5G front haul market. So there are, spots there for VC investments in that space, but not that much indeed. Secondly, companies that design and apply 5G communication has become a hot topic of innovation. So whole new generation of hardware and devices to take advantage with 5G in high volume, that's what we like as a VC. And these devices will be able to send and receive information in real time, which will open up a lot of opportunities. And there are many verticals that would be affected. So indeed, we or the equity investors or the VC investors, we like the green, I call the fun part, AR, VR, drones, not that much, in the infrastructure. And indeed, in that space, we would need more public funding or in combination public and private investments. But nevertheless, in 2019, Qualcomm has launched the Qualcomm Venture 5G ecosystem to invest $200 million in companies building the 5G ecosystem. Cisco Systems is also investing a ton of capital into startups. And last year, T-Mobile created T-Mobile Ventures, a new venture arm to invest in 5G products and services. So I believe with all those new investors out of the segments, I think there's going to be a great opportunity for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I think we will discuss later in the panel the fun part, as you mentioned it. And as you also just mentioned, Qualcomm, let's move on to Luigi Ardito. And he will share with us the outcome of a study on the cost-benefit ratio for Europe to have a full 5G platform. Over to you, Luigi.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everybody. 5G deployment really is bringing one-in-a-lifetime opportunity to deliver a greener, more inclusive, and more resilient economic recovery. There are some benefits for the economy, to decarbonize the economy. There is an increase in energy efficiency. There is an improvement in transport safety. There is also a transformation of industries and much more in order to also achieve the objectives of the EU Recovery Plan and the Green Deal. Next slide, please. So at Qualcomm, what we have done, first of all, we have commissioned a study, global study, but also we will see later on in the presentation, also we have done one specifically for Europe. And as 5G, will extend and will expand to new industry. We wanted to understand basically what were the benefits. And what we found is actually that there are benefits amounting for 13.2 trillion in global economic value by 2035. And the areas are those which you see in the slide. So we are talking about precision agriculture, construction and mining, digitized education, connected healthcare, smart cities, intelligent retail, smart manufacturing, and of course, richer mobile experiences. Next slide, please. If we look then at Europe, and we have heard from previous speakers, we know that the European Commission has set up this 750 billion next generation EU package to revive the economy after COVID-19, and 20% of that will be actually invested in digital, including 5G. There are recovery funds also available at the national level. It's important, for example, to highlight the 5 billion in rural 5G infra for Germany and the 2 billion they are going to use for Open RAN. And of course, we will see such kind of initiatives across other European member states. Next slide, please. So in this context, we have actually commissioned an additional study, and this study is focused actually on Europe and is focused on a full 5G implementation. So we have seen 5G as an open innovation platform, and what we wanted to know what it will actually add to Europe. So the basis of the modeling approach was that the full 5G network can support a wide range of possible innovations in different markets and industrial sectors. And so the study considers social, economic, and environmental benefits of a number of use cases, which then have been grouped in clusters. And to cut this short, basically, an estimate conservative of the benefits which were calculated by Analysis Mason was totaling about 210 billion in benefits at the cost of 46 billion by 2025. And in terms of clusters, we grouped the market segments into basically 4 key areas: smart production and logistics, smart rural, smart urban, and smart public services. And the smart production and smart rural clusters had actually the largest net benefits, at basically more or less 70 billion and 55 billion respectively. At the use case level, you can see in the slide the largest economic benefits in terms of European GDP impact are from the smart factories, the agriculture, and the FWA for suburban and rural areas use cases. And these are providing net benefits of about 58, 37, and 18 billion respectively. But also we have done a little bit more, a step further. So we wanted also to identify the key areas that would require partial or full public funding in order for the benefits to be realized. And what we found is that with 20 billion of public funding, we could achieve actually 50 billion in Europe of benefits that can be delivered. Obviously, there are caveats. It is important that Europe goes on with the plan and makes available the bands, the 5G spectrum bands. So the 700, the 3.5, the mid bands, and the high bands. But we'll probably talk about this a little bit later on. Next slide, please. And another important area we wanted to focus the attention today is about these 5G corridors. Europe is really the biggest experimental area for 5G automotive. And there is a substantial funding which is provided for these transport corridors. We are also active in some of them across Italy, Germany, and Austria. Next slide, please, for my conclusions. So in terms of future policy, what it is important, given what we learned from the studies and what it is happening in the market? Well, for us, it is important to release and fast track all the spectrum bands, including the millimeter wave. It is important to reduce the cost and increase the speed of the 5G rollout, including the small cells. It is very important, the initiatives on public-private, and important areas are Open RAN, transportation, smart factories, FWA. And also it is very important, in our view, a 5G Action Plan 2.0. So with this, I conclude my presentation, and thank you for watching.
Very much, Luigi. And there's a lot of potential on the table, as you have shown, and let's see how telco operators will be able to participate at this potential. Let's now come to the last intro presentation given by Adrien Bresson, and he will share with us the perspective of France on 5G in their national recovery plan. Over to you, Adrien.
Yeah, thank you. So hello everybody. So I'm working for French Ministry for the Economy, and today, so I would like to emphasize actions France is planning to take in the context of the recovery plan. So the French government is convinced that 5G is an opportunity for key sectors of our economy, and so that is why we have made 5G one of our priorities for the recovery plan. So we have a dedicated national strategy on 5G we are currently elaborating. And the aim is to propose a comprehensive set of public policies on 5G and future network technologies in order to support all the 5G ecosystem. So we want to focus our support on private companies for sure. First of all, equipment manufacturers, like for instance, Nokia and Ericsson have important R&D activities in France, but we want also to support French SMEs with highly innovative solutions in network technologies. For instance, in France, we have like Amarisoft, who is an innovative SME, which is developing radio access networks software solutions. And we have also companies which are developing core network solutions, like for instance, Alice. So we want to support this ecosystem. For sure, we will also support telecom operators, verticals who can use 5G, as well as research institutes and academic institutes. So within this national strategy, 5G applications in vertical markets is one of the key priorities identified, because we really do think it is key to strengthen the demand for 5G use cases. So we want to focus on industrial 5G use cases, but also on non-industrial 5G use cases. For instance, in rural areas, because we do think that it is key to have 5G acceptability by citizens, to show that 5G can benefit citizens and that in daily life it can really benefit to usage also in rural areas. So in this context, we have launched last year a call for projects called Sovereignty in Telecom Networks in order to accelerate 5G applications to vertical markets, with the aim to support 5G experimentation projects. And this call for projects proved to be a real success because we received more than 30 projects with very various 5G use cases and various verticals mobilized. And that's why we are renewing this call for projects for 2021. So the first 5G experimentation projects were awarded early 2021, and I would just like to give an example of a project, which is a project led by Sequence, which is a French SME producing chipsets. And the aim of the project is to develop 5G critical use cases for industrial IoT with application in aeronautics, for instance, because you can use IoT in order to download very fast data on the plane after test flights. And also there's an application field in railways. And what is interesting with this project is that the 5G infrastructure is provided by French SMEs with highly innovative solutions in network technologies. Besides, the French government has also launched actions in order to structure the 5G ecosystems. And so that is why we have launched since 2019 what we call the Strategic Committee on Digital Infrastructure, which convenes nearly 400 French telecom players in order to address collectively the challenges of the sectors. And so this strategic committee has one flagship project, which is the implementation of a network of 5G experimentation platform, which means that concretely the different 5G experimentation projects we are supporting within the recovery plan, as I mentioned it, are going to be integrated to this network. So we create a long-term network in order to stimulate 5G innovation use cases, and we really hope it will help verticals to adopt very fast 5G and develop 5G use cases. And so just as a conclusion, I would like to highlight that between what we are going at a national level and what European programs plan to do to support 5G, it is really key that we have a complementary tweet between both programs so we can make the most of it and develop important and innovative new 5G use cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrienne, and thanks to all of you, to all the panelists. And now it's time to start and kick off the panel, the open panel discussions. There are a lot of questions flying in, which shows that the topic we cover is of high relevance for everybody, which is good. And let me try to maybe cluster the questions a bit. And let me start with a question or two questions, the first to Philippe and the second to Harold, on the challenge areas, which were addressed a couple of times. So Philippe, I would be really interested to learn about the EU perspective regarding connectivity alongside railway tracks, which is one of the challenge areas. Because in many countries, for instance in Germany as well, this is really disappointing, I must say. And the main reasons are, from my perspective, there's no dedicated trackside infrastructure. It's part of the macro network of a telco. And there are too many wide or great spots as the build out is economically not viable for operators. So the question is, will EU funds be linked to, let's say, more sustainable and efficient business models, like a really dedicated infrastructure with a high amount of sharing of at least the passive infrastructure, both between the MNOs and the railway companies? Or will we further support the current system, which is not really yeah, so good at the end of the day. What is the view of the EU on that, Philippe?
Thank you, Michael. This is really a priority for us. It's probably one of the two most mature 5G ecosystem, for whatever mature they are, but in preparation at the moment. You know that last April, it was in 2020, so almost a year ago, the first version of a strategic deployment agenda was signed between the main stakeholders in this area, the two associations, the infrastructure managers and the railway undertaking association. So we have already a good basis. And really knowing that the technology will completely change in the railway industry from 2025, because we will move to the future rail communication system, as you know, from 2025, and there will also be a new automatic rail operations. If we don't combining this technology transition with 5G, we will miss a major opportunity. That's why the Commission is really pushing this, as well as a deployment that combines both the digital operation for rail and what we call the gigabit train, which is the service to passengers, sharing the same infrastructure, obviously. Now, I will finish by saying that the business model, we don't want to anticipate. Of course, there could be business model where the rail operators have more control, and others where mobile network operators do investment and hence have more control. This is still open, but we have now a window of 2 to 3 years to converge on this and to establish the next generation. So this is really a priority for us.
Okay, thanks a lot. This is good to hear. It's going into this direction, the right direction. And Harald, over to you, as you also mentioned a couple of times, the challenge areas. So from your perspective, what are the main challenges for raising market-based financing for a quick rollout of 5G infrastructure, especially in those challenge areas like less densely populated or very rural areas or railways?
I mean, the main problem of rapid rollout is typically costs. I mean, it's basically this is a basic infrastructure, so it has its cost, which is to a large degree civil engineering, and also especially in mobile, there's equipment which has a relatively rapid technological decay, because in the mobile sector the technology cycles are very low. So you have to basically, a challenge for an investor is to make to put on the table quite sizable amounts of money and get a relatively quick feedback, which is challenging for an infrastructure. I mean, it was easy in the past when you were able just to sell minutes for voice talk over the phone. So you could basically appropriate fairly quickly the money. But once you have just sort of a data traffic, it's increasingly difficult to capture value out of what's traveling over there. It could be just junk that's on the thing, or very highly valuable content. So the operator cannot anymore discriminate between the thing, or can discriminate only to some degree. And this is the challenge for investors and for operators then to raise private funding for this type of infrastructure. On top of it, I mean, governments do everything to make it even more challenging. For instance, in the mobile sector, for basically tendering the spectrum, where normally you have very high basically results in terms of yields from spectrum auctions, which has the perverse consequence that basically who is putting that money on the table? It's typically established operator, which use that money just to preempt any new entrant to come in. But they don't use then the spectrum to roll out early the new network, because they say we have spent all our money. So that's why I think it has perverse implications. So basically, if governments ask for high license fee, they cannot ask for a quick rollout. So you have this kind of trade-offs that you need to consider. And I mean, the sector is a little bit bedeviled by these contradictions. And the major consequences are, of course, areas like rural areas are the last to be covered. And clearly then the operators come along, please, governments, help me in rolling out, because I cannot get the payback that's needed to raise private money. And yeah.
So we have both the issues, how to best invest the capex available, when a certain amount of it goes into the spectrum already. And secondly, with which kind of business model can we as a telco industry participate at the, I think, 160 billion, which Luigi put up as a potential.
And precisely, financial instruments are supposed to basically to help in this effort, because basically they try to provide a good equilibrium between risk sharing and basically providing payback on private capital. And if cleverly done, this can be very, very successful. I mean, there can be basically you have layered funds or layered financial structures whereby basically the public sector fund is the last to be paid off. So if the project is underperforming, the private investors are paid first, and the public sector investors, they're paid last. And so basically those hold much of the losses. But if there are upsides, I mean, if it's a tremendous success, I mean, there's a clawback of the support mechanism. So this is sort of an inbuilt mechanisms to share the risk, and which can be very, very effective in assuring a rapid rollout of infrastructure.
So what I understand is that EIB is already developing those special financial instruments for this kind of purpose.
Yes, they are already in place. In part, they have been already they're in place, but there is scope for developing further these kind of activities, because there you need. It's very difficult to get the private side on board of this instrument. So we have now learning from the existing activities, which allow us to fine tune the instruments in a way to get a better performance of basically attracting private investors to those type of instruments.
Okay, thank you very much. Then Susan, the next question is to you, because you're the private investor for the fun part, the applications, the nice applications. Do you see a trend in Europe for VC investments going into any industries, or any industries getting more financing in particular than other industries? How would you see that?
Yes, indeed. As we all know that European Union has some talents here, and I would say in particular in couple spaces. One of them is, if I may still include UK as a European part of the Europe. In particular, I think the segment of AI, and as I have mentioned earlier, the true value of 5G also lies in the combination of AI, 5G, and so on. And I think AI, but it's not, I would say, in particular European phenomena. If you look into US as well as China, AI is quite a hot topic right now. So it goes so far that, if you look at pitch deck, that you can't find actually a pitch deck without mentioning AI couple times in the slides. So AI is one sector. And then the second sector, I would say, would be also photonics. As I mentioned earlier also, that in Germany, for instance, there seemed to be a hub in Dresden for photonics. And so photonics coming along with semiconductor also here in Europe. I think there we also have, in particular in RF or in power electronics, there are some strength in Europe. And then lastly, maybe also in quantum computing, there we also see some movements. And those, AI together with anything, like sensors and so on. That's a hot topic within the VC space, as well as I mentioned, photonics, quantum mechanics, and
So it's actually more on application clusters than on verticals, on industries where the money goes.
Yeah, yeah. But since you mentioned verticals, and in terms of the verticals, I think we here in Europe are very strong, and this has been also mentioned, I think, a couple of times in the automotive sectors, and in the 5G space. 5G is one part, but in combination with 5G, going into the verticals, I think without knowing the domain, it's going to hard to develop use cases based on 5G. So a close collaboration between the verticals and telecom operator and telecom provider, that's, I think, also a key to be successful and be innovated in the use case.
Thank you, Susan. So Luigi, I see your report also receives high interest and you experience a lot of downloads. Two questions to you. Where are we in Europe in terms of 5G rollout and spectrum release? First question, and second, if I may, what is Qualcomm doing to enable a wide and fast 5G rollout?
Okay. Yeah, in terms of where are we on 5G rollout, Europe has done pretty well so far. We had about over 30 actually commercial networks deployed over 15 countries. So this has been a very good step forward. I must say Europe could do more on some fronts in the sense that, for example, European countries were legally bounded to make all spectrum available in the pioneering bands by the end of 2020, but still some countries haven't released 3.5 gigahertz in some part, but in particular has been slow on 26 gigahertz on millimeter wave. And for Qualcomm, it is important that all the three bands are actually made available to the market, because the full 5G is really realized when all the three bands are there, so low bands, mid band, high bands. So far, millimeter wave, there are 6 countries in Europe. We expect another 7 or 8 this year, taking it to 14. But still, I mean, in Europe there are 27 countries, so there are 13 others to go, and that will need to be fixed in some form somehow. Obviously, things are moving, are progressing better now. But there is some way to go and could be better, the rollout of 5G. What is Qualcomm doing to expand and to have a fast rollout? So first of all, Suzanne has mentioned, we established a big fund, a venture fund. 170 million has already been spent to actually have a ecosystem, developing the ecosystem across the world. Specifically, also including Europe, what we have done, I mean, we made chipset and we have included the support for all the spectrum bands, the pioneering bands of Europe. So they are included, although some of them are not utilized in all the European countries. But this is a big upfront investment which Qualcomm is doing. Has done actually. In addition to that, our chipset are equipping not only the premium tier, but we have started also going to the mid tier. So we want really to address a big device ecosystem of 3.5 billion smartphones. So we have the Snapdragon 7, 6, 5, and 4 series. So it's becoming big. And we have been pretty active also in other areas. I mean, like industrial, we have done in collaboration with companies like Bosch, Siemens, 5G private networks. We are investing a lot in automotive with the trials led by European Commission. So this is we are acting. These are not the only sectors where we are doing things to expand 5G in Europe.
Okay, thank you, Luigi. Then Adrian, over to you. You were talking about innovative use cases. So which actions can be taken from your perspective at the European level to help develop innovative 5G use cases?
Yeah, sure. Yes, so I think that first, European funding can be really important in order to focus on large-scale 5G experiments, which couldn't be easily launched at a national level. So, for instance, as I explained, in France, we are trying to put in place 5G experiments, dedicated vertical markets. But for instance, if you want to address 5G corridors in highways, it could be more difficult to finance such projects. So for sure, European funding could be important to that aspect. I do think also that at the European level, it could be interesting to try to better structure 5G ecosystem and to employ verticals. So, for instance, there are really things that could be done using 5G, like for instance, connecting a factory in Germany and a factory in France, and using 5G and augmented realities that could do things together. So these are really ambitious projects, which that with European support, maybe it could be possible. And then the last point I would like to emphasize is that it seems key that at the European level, they have significant R&D funding to develop the technology, because for sure, so there's already some kind of 5G, but there are still development needed to have a real 5G standalone and to really make the most of vertical 5G use cases. So it's really key that we can also support R&D activities.
Thank you. You just also mentioned the term ecosystem, and it was mentioned a couple of times in all the presentations, also in the morning. So maybe a question to you and then also to Philippe. How do we align the different national perspectives and speeds in building such ecosystems with the European perspective? I mean, I think we learned that ecosystem building development is really key for the success of 5G deployment. So how do we align those two perspectives?
Okay. Now, on this, I do think it is really important that in Europe we take advantage of the companies we have, and especially SMEs which are developing technologies on the networks, because we think that we have the capacity with those companies to build 5G networks, especially for private 5G networks. And so strengthening such an ecosystem, it would be great, so that verticals can understand that they can find easily 5G equipment, and they have maybe a wider choice of equipments. And we really have strength in Europe on this, and we need to support this.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Do you want to add, Philippe, on that?
A very short answer would be to start from the beginning to think pan-European. Yeah. Today, telcos, for historical reason, have an anchor. Many of them have a national anchor. There are very few which are pan-European. However, on the demand side, in the verticals, most of the big players are European players. So we need to put them together and from the beginning avoid fragmentation. Very important. Also, a venture capital strategy or venture financing strategy need to be pan-European, because today also venture capitalists tend to be focused on their national markets. That's also something we need to influence as far as we can. It's also soft power, as I mentioned before. We have to do it efficiently.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can continue with you, Philippe, and then also the same question to you, Luigi. What's your, in that case, the Commission's position regarding public investments in Open RAN technology and the potential for innovation that it represents?
I can be very quick, because I understand it will also be the topic of another session. What I can say is that we always welcome innovation, and we note with interest the announcement by major operators and the support from some member states. But however, we still feel we lack the essential data to have an official position. There is no official position from the European Commission at the moment on Open RAN. We have to weigh in the security risks, the stemming from the large attack surface, the power consumption challenge, the interoperability aspects, the risk of delay in standardization with impact on deployment. So all this, we did two things to tackle. This one is that there is a study going on that should end in June this year. This is the second study actually on the future supply in telecom, which is wider than the ORAN. It's also edge cloud and so on. There we will get critical data also for positioning us from a geopolitical viewpoint to see what's the advantage for Europe. And the second thing we do is to encourage all stakeholders to be involved in the joint undertaking, the smart network and services undertaking that we are launching soon, because there will be a working group working on that, the wider aspect, the softwareization and the model for RAN, starting third quarter probably this year.
Okay, so we have to wait a bit. Thank you. Looking forward to that. Luigi, do you want to add to that question or?
No, I think it's. I mean, we are on the same page. Open RAN is very important for innovation, and probably in the future is going to have play an important role also for private networks. So it's really important for innovation, for unlocking innovation in Europe.
Maybe one more question to the potential you laid out. When do we expect to really kick that in, as we learn that it's, it takes time for the deployment, takes time to build the ecosystems, to get the funding together. So when do you see the real potential kicking in?
This is a question for Philippe.
No, for you, Luigi. Sorry, to you.
Well, what is happening at the moment? I mean, we believe the ecosystem is busy to build these mobile broadband networks across Europe, and that is going to cost some money. I mean, after this session, there will be another session hosted by Qualcomm where we reveal the result of another study saying that it is going to cost about 150 billion euro to deploy mobile broadband networks across the European countries. So that means basically that using the current spectrum plus the pioneering bands. Then it depends on what you want to do in terms of coverage. If you are population led, it is 150 billion, but then if you start considering also near universal coverage, you get another 15% more of that. Because you need to expand also, the 700 megahertz. You need to also have an expansion for mid-bands for the transportation, road rails, etc. And then you also need actually, more densification, small cells, etc. So basically, this will last until 2025, and then there will be a full 5G platform built. Obviously, it's not just either you stop one and you start with the other one. There will be some process going in parallel. So there will be a transition period from now until 2025.
Okay, thank you. And then there was a question flying into Harold, saying with the capital intensity of European telcos being about 30% higher than US telcos and up by 25% over the past 8 years, what can national regulators do to revive the long-term infrastructure investment environment across Europe?
I mean, this I would like to refer a little bit to what I had already mentioned earlier. I mean, it's clearly Europe is a relatively high cost base for infrastructure rollout. I mean, there are requirements, basically regulatory requirements. I mean, Europe has very high standards for services. It has regulated standards, so they tend to be much more expensive than sort of market-oriented standards. There are standards in basically in fulfilling certain regulatory requirements. For instance, regulation in Europe on the sector has been very keen on basically keeping consumer prices, retail prices at a low level, which has induced very often sort of I mean, actually, it would actually one would concern that investment would go actually the other way around. We would have a lack of investment, but it is one of the incentives that for operators not to spend more than actually required from the on the already a relatively high cost basis. So maybe that even though if some of those high cost bases could also be translated into sort of into final prices, probably this would also be one incentive more for investment, especially private investors, to put more money on sort of this kind of infrastructure. So I think there are plenty of ways to go about it. One needs to be very creative, and one needs to learn from some countries which do perform better than other countries. And I think that's one of the good opportunities in Europe to learn from each other, because you have different national requirements on rollout. We can, for instance, we see that very much on fiber to the home rollout. I mean, you can compare the experience that you have in France, which is where it is going very excellent, in other countries where it is enormously expensive, and you can ask yourself, what's the difference? Well, what can we learn from this? And so I think it requires learning from each other and be open-minded, I think. So that's my take. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then maybe one last question before we come to the conclusion of this panel. There's a question that I would assume that much of the demand within industrial deployment, including smart parking, smart traffic, and even connected houses and IoT, are dense deployments, but not so much high capacity or high bandwidth requirements. So outside of the mostly personal multimedia entertainment and mobile, would the revenues realistically be able to cover the expected massive costs of deployment? Who wants to take that question? Please, with a short answer.
Maybe I can just kick it off. Indeed, and that's currently what we are working on our factory sites. So to see use case by use case, where does it make sense? Where really do I need low latency? Where is it just enough to have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth? And cost-wise, and depending on what source and whom you ask, 5G chip, it depends on the volume, but let's say if you have a high volume, it goes from 15 to 50 euro. So it depends whom you ask. So that's quite an investment for a chip. And Bluetooth chip is just a fraction of it. So our guys are going indeed case by case and to see, okay, where does it make sense to make that investment?
Okay, thank you, Susan. So let us conclude this panel with a final question to each of you, with a request for a very short answer, please. So just maybe one sentence. And the question is, there's so much money on the table, as we've heard, and it's such a complex topic. So what are, from your perspective, the key risks we need to manage over the next years? Who wants to start?
I can start.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of money on the table, but very often, ironically, the money is not so much the problem. So very often for certain type of deployment, you need to have skills available. You need to have business opportunities out there for mobilizing that money. So if you just put a lot of public money on the table, it's probably not well spent. This is the big risk. So therefore, the challenge is that you're able to discipline these large amounts of money for efficient investments, for investment that's really putting societies forward, and not sort of when you 5 years later say, oh, this was not a very good investment. And this, I think, we are spending the money of our children. I mean, our children will be already bedevilled by high public debt levels. And I think it is our obligation to spend this money that for the time being allows us to live over our means in an efficient way, that in the future we still have high productive societies that allow also for our children to have high living standards.
Okay, thank you, Harold.
So I would...
For Susan, sorry, ladies first.
Sorry. So I would agree with Harold. I think speed also is the key, effective investment. So I read somewhere something like if you want to read about 5G, see the press releases from the EU, but if you want to see it, go to the US or China. So I think we really need to prove it wrong and to speed up and get it ready for new use cases and innovations.
Thank you, Susan. Then Philip.
Then I have to react to Susan. I mean, 5G is disruptive. It can disrupt the telecom industry, but we can also disrupt EU policy. And I think maybe we are at an inflection point. If you look at the kind of resources we have now and the mindset of member states. But in one sentence, to rebound also on Harald's warnings, the amount is not so important, but the amount gives us, the public side, a seat at the table. And when we have a seat at the table and we put a few chips on the table, we force ecosystem to accelerate. Instead of saying, please do this, do that, we say, look, we put 1 billion, for example, connecting Europe, a facility for the corridors for automated cars. You co-invest and you have to find the first business models. This is a powerful tool. And we use it for the benefit of all, because don't forget, 5G has a lot of externalities. If we can cut gas emissions with automated driving, we do a lot of good outside of pure economic benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. That would be a great discussion for a physical coffee break if we had. Unfortunately, we don't. So, Luigi, your concluding statement.
Well, just 3 words: speed, priority, and actually, execution.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. And Adrian, last but
I think that we need to invest in the use cases and experimentation, which can be long-term experimentation and not only showcases, which will disappear after the recovery plan.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think we're just on time. It was really a pleasure to moderate this panel session, and I hope it was interesting to everybody listening. And thank you, Dan, for organizing that.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to all of our panelists. And I think the level of the number of questions and comments we had in, I think, shows that it was indeed interesting to everyone who was listening and everyone who was joining that. So thank you all very much. Another really interesting panel. Thank you. So yeah, we got round to asking quite a few of those questions, answering quite a few of those questions, I should say. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions there. But if there are any questions that you want to put to any individual speakers, then I'm sure you can do that via the chat function, and they'll be able to come back to you. But thank you all for your questions, and thank you again to Michael and to all of our panelists as well. So we next move on straight away now to our showcase sessions. So the showcase sessions, for those of you who maybe haven't attended one of our conferences before, are breakout sessions which are led by some of our sponsor and partner organizations. And it's an opportunity to go into a bit more detail on some of the key issues and themes we're talking about in other sessions throughout the event. So, for example, I know that Luigi mentioned the report from Qualcomm, which has been part of the discussions a few times in that last session. On Showcase Stage 1, Qualcomm are actually hosting a session which is going to be looking at specifically that report and looking at 5G millimeter wave deployment, the state of play in Europe. So feel free to join that one to find out more about the Qualcomm report there. On Showcase Stage 2, we have a session that's looking at developing competitive advantage via your spectrum strategy, a playbook for operators and regulators, and that's going to be hosted by LYA. So again, feel free to join that and get an overview from them on how you can do that and develop your competitive advantage there. And on Showcase Stage 3, we're focusing on 5G and cities. So looking at why collaboration and connectivity is key to smart transportation success. So again, please do join that showcase hosted by Ericsson to find out more about those key issues there. One thing to mention, obviously, these 3 sessions are taking place in parallel, but don't worry if you wanted to attend more than one, they are all being recorded and recordings will be made available afterwards. So you'll be able to catch up on any of those showcases that you haven't been able to catch up on. So those are starting now on the 3 showcase stages. You just need to click on the Stages tab on the left-hand side and make your selection from there. So we'll see you in those showcases stages very shortly. And then following that, we are back here on the main stage at 3:45 CET for the final session of the day, which is looking at maybe beyond 5G, also looking at the issue of staying sovereign, digital sovereignty as well. So looking forward to that as well. Thank you again to our panelists, and looking forward to seeing you in the showcase sessions very shortly. Thank you.